We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Hi, this is Ryan Mckelley, and you are listening to the Mankind podcast.
Looks like the rain has gone.
What's up, guys, gals, and non-binary pals? Happy Pride Month and welcome to another episode of the Mankind Podcast, where today we are going to be demystifying and removing some of the myths around the phrase toxic masculinity. Now, I've used this phrase many times, perhaps you have, or you may have heard it used to describe and paint men who behave in horrible ways, that show characteristics of masculinity that is hurting and harming others. But what if we are using this phrase wrong? What if we are actually weaponizing this phrase to cause more harm than good? And perhaps there's a deeper force at play behind these behaviors and a different conversation that needs to be had. Enter Dr. Ryan Mckelley. He is a licensed psychologist. He is a researcher. He is a professor. He is a teacher. He is a listener. He is a consultant. He is an educator, and he is a guide who is going to help you, me, and all of us listening out there how to better understand the experiences of men and how the use of the phrase toxic masculinity may be doing more harm than good. Now, what I believe you're really going to enjoy about my discussion with Ryan is how well he does to zoom out, to show remarkable amounts of empathy before broad stroking someone with a label, right? Before going into all this story of why said person is bad and why they need to be outcast from society, he encourages us to really look at the full picture and really ask the question, why is this behavior happening? Whether it's happening on a structural level, whether it's happening societally, or whether it's happening to the actual individual, we can't really solve the greater problems facing society if we just instantly attack the character, if we instantly just attacked the gender, right? The stance politically. We really need to get to know the situation at hand before we start broad stroking and casting these judgments. And so you're going to walk away from this interview learning new tools of how to communicate poor behaviors, right? How to speak to challenges, how to call people in instead of call them out, as well as we cover how the us versus them mentality is really making things worse in the world, and it isn't making things better. So how about we put on our ally hats, and how about we turn up the empathy dial to better understand those of us who may not be behaving in a way that some consider kosher, who may not be behaving in a way that we would objectively say is right. And why don't we open the door to help them see a different way of being, a different way of living, and to welcome them into society rather than to cast them out. Enjoy this episode with Dr. Ryan Mckelley. G'day and welcome to another live recording of the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove that there's more than just one way to be a man. And when we have conversations that pertain to manhood masculinity, you often hear the phrase toxic masculinity. Like that we see certain leaders, certain people in media, certain celebrities, sports stars behave in a way that essentially represents masculinity in a toxic fashion. Now, I've used the phrase, but also can now admit, having done my research in preparation for this interview, that I have used it incorrectly, that in fact the phrase itself is debatable and questionable, but also that there's some validity, I think, in what people are saying when they reference toxic masculinity. So in order to dive into this, in order to really understand the complexity and facets of language and how we essentially speak to behavior of men in today's society, I wanted to bring on Professor Ryan Mckelley. Mate, go introduce yourself to the audience for those that don't already know you, because, mate, you have done more things in your studies around men, masculinity, around mental health as well. So I am really excited to have this conversation, mate. Take it away.
Hey, Brandon, I'm honored to be here. I love the Mankind Project and the work that you're doing, and I've been following your interviews. And so it's just a real honor to be here. Yeah, I'm Ryan Mckelley. I'm a professor. I'm also a licensed psychologist. Most of my work really is around men's health, men's mental health, physical health. I've been a professor for 13 years. Before that, I was a management consultant, so it was a totally different world. But my interests are kind of in health psychology broadly, but then specifically in men's health. And so I've got studies on men's emotional expression and men in non-traditional roles. Right now, I'm kind of in a phase where I'm really just interested in doing a lot more workshops and programming for the public, talking about masculinity, but I do some therapy work, men's support groups, that kind of stuff. So kind of all across the board.
Mate, let's first dive into it. What is your understanding right now of what toxic masculinity is, or why it's even used as a phrase?
Yeah, I'm with you. I was pretty, I have mixed feelings about it because I always say like that the word was kind of weaponized by media as a way to just kind of talk about men's behavior and men behaving badly. However, we're using it. And so although I don't use it academically, I do use it in my conversations with people. And so I think when people talk about the toxic parts of masculinity, they're really just talking about the parts that harm self and others. So it's those attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that are harmful to ourselves and each other. I've kind of shifted from using the term, I use the 3 R's. So I think we talk about toxic masculinity, we're talking about rigid masculinity, like so our unwillingness to bend and shift and adjust in a moment. Reactive masculinity, I think it's that part, particularly like anger and aggression, right? The part that causes harm to others without kind of reflecting on what's going on. So I think a lot of people experience toxic masculinity as a reactive kind of energy. And then restrictive, this idea that there's only like a couple different ways I can be a man and it being kind of limiting. So I think when I hear toxic, I think of those 3 R's.
I like that. All of those 3 R's, reactive, restrictive, rigid, they all really speak to the man box, right? That we've been talking about a lot in this show, right? These are the unspoken but expected rules of the playground for boys that also gets carried into manhood. And I'm keen to hear about this, how toxic masculinity is weaponized. Like, what is a way in which we can weaponize a phrase in order to call out a certain group, right? Whether it be gender, race.
Yeah. Well, we take one example or one instance of behavior, one piece of a story, and make it the whole story. And so we do put out you see headlines and stuff on your social media feed about, toxic men. And so you might take somebody who's well known, it could be a celebrity or a politician, and you talk about just this as toxic masculinity without knowing the full story or telling all the other components that are part of it. Again, sometimes like simplifying things makes the world a little easier to navigate, but humans are complex. And so it's never the full story. So it's really important for us to kind of dig in. When somebody says, that's toxic masculinity, I want to know specifically, like, what exactly are you talking about? And let's zoom out and figure out what are all the conditions under which this is getting expressed or shown or experienced.
Sure. I can definitely see how, toxic behavior, that has been committed by a male, it's very easy to then lump the two together, which inherently is going to make people feel defensive, like they're on the back foot, like they feel like that no room is given for them to either explain or to be heard or to actually for there to be an investigation into what the behavior actually was. I think we can just look at these verbose behaviors and go, nah, toxic masculinity. In fact, the whole male gender right now is really messing up on this front. So any chance that we see someone behave in a way that isn't kosher, that isn't just a nice way to behave, and they happen to be male, like, let's just boom, slap that label, and also slap that whole responsibility to do something about it on men. So
I use the example of like competition. And this is where sometimes I know people get kind of defensive about it. So if somebody sees somebody engaging in like some super competitive behavior, they'll say, oh, that's toxic. Competition is toxic. And you are athletes. I'm an athlete as well. There's some really healthy components to competition, right? Like there's self-competitiveness where you're just trying to strive to do better than before. There's also a lot of care and compassion in competition, right? People supporting each other and being a better version of their self. But if we call competition itself problematic or toxic, we're basically throwing out a lot of other adaptive and positive ways of being competitive and showing competitiveness. That's kind of a light example, but that's one that just kind of jumps out, that if you say it's toxic, it's easy to just kind of throw it all out, and so we can't compete. Right? That's not a good thing.
Got you. How would you approach these conversations? Like, what would you do if one of your students was to come to you and say, well, this figure behaved in this way on the weekend, it's all over the news, that is toxic masculinity at its finest? How would you approach that conversation, say with that student, to both understand where they're coming from, but also like give your 2 cents from your 13 years of experience?
Yeah. I do a lot of just trying to zoom out. I won't get into the technical, actually it's called the correspondence bias in psychology. This idea that if we see somebody else do a negative behavior, we say it's something about their personality, right? So we attribute it to you and who you are. If we engage in that same negative behavior, we attribute to the situation or the environment and say, well, I was tired, or I felt threatened, or right. And so, I frame the conversation that way and say, okay, we have a behavior. And right now you're saying it's something about this person. But now let's step back and say, what are all the other conditions under which this behavior sometimes occurs? Like what might lead somebody to do something like that? And to try to get people to kind of zoom out and think, wow, here are all the reasons why, or possible reasons why a male might respond with aggression. We might go all the way back to what's their potential trauma history? How were they met when they were younger with emotional pain? Were they allowed space to do that or not? Or were they told to shut up and man up? What was their development like? What's their current stressors about? Are they maybe they're victims of whatever ism, racism? There could be a whole host of things happening, right, in somebody's life. It doesn't excuse somebody's negative behavior, and I'm very clear about that. Right? That's not what this is about, but it's about understanding like what are all the pieces, all the components that are there together that can help us understand where these behaviors come from, because then we have a much better chance of supporting each other in healthier behaviors and engaging in healthy ways.
Thank you for kind of spelling that out a bit more. I feel like when I want to condemn someone's behavior and then slap a label on them, it's because they're male, right? Or it's because they're this ethnic background, or if those labels get thrown down, it really blocks off the opportunity to connect to the individual in the circumstance. And of course, there is data that suggests all these impacts happening on a macro level, right? If we're talking people of difference or backgrounds, but still we can't, I think there's a lot of danger there, right? To just broad stroke people with labels. I think that feeds to the us versus them mentality. I think there are a lot of people that are very invested in tearing down any idea or notions or, the patriarchy, let's just say. I know there are people that have their own opinions on the existence of a patriarchy, but they're so committed and emotionally attached to that again, any negative behavior committed by a male, boom, toxic masculinity equates to the patriarchy. And it really doesn't give that individual a chance to be heard, to be invited into the conversation. Perhaps, again, like you said, what was modeled to them? What was their environment growing up that has contributed to these behaviors? And again, these negative behaviors can't be just wiped over. Oh, he had a bad childhood, let's just forget. That's his excuse. We can let him get away with it with a slap on the wrist. No, But those are factors that have to be taken into consideration and account, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's easy to go either or, right? To go dichotomous, and so I would challenge a student or anybody. It's like we got to go both and. Again, like you said, it's not excusing it, but we got to think we have to be willing to think harder about this, because if you want to see any change, it's not going to be simple. It's not going to be, zeros and ones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Messy. That's what people often say, especially as it just pertains to men's work, that men's work is messy. It's not linear. And for men to bring these things to the surface takes a lot of work. In your TED Talk, I loved your TED Talk. You tell a story about this man that you were working with, that from the jump, you didn't want to work with him because of his behaviors, because of what he was basically in there for. Can you give some context to that? And that'll lead to my next question.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up that client. I get chills actually thinking about that client, because what started off as just a really challenging therapeutic situation, like I did not, I'll just say I didn't like him, was very aggressive, very angry, would kind of spend the first 45 minutes of a 50-minute session blaming the rest of the world for everything. He took no responsibility. But as we started working together, I realized in addition to having a really, really traumatic experience growing up, from being the victim of violence in the home and drug addiction and all kinds of financial problems, also was really trying hard to do better, right, with his current family situation. And through our work together, he had just this incredible fear of meeting his emotions, and had said that he bottled everything up on the inside. And so our therapeutic work was really about getting in touch with that and learning to meet it and manage it with some compassion. And he really did end up being probably one of the favorite people I've ever worked with, because there was such heart there, but it was under so many layers of pain and restriction and all these other things.
That's when we talk about the mission of the Mankind Project, you're going to hear many different renditions. And one of my favorite missions is to heal the hearts of men. And a lot of people might see that character like this client that you're talking about, I'm happy that you shared that. I mean, it's so natural to think that that therapists, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists are like experts at objectivity, right? They can separate themselves from the client regardless who they are. But I mean, I've often wondered about the psychotherapist or whichever helping profession just sits there and goes, I can't stand this person. But look at the impact it had on you, right? To be able to get to his heart and to understand that this tough exterior was just layer upon layer upon layer, really just defense. And you were able to get him there, right? I mean, in the TED Talk, you say that this guy's like, I know what you're trying to do, and I'm not going to do it. Like, I'm not going to cry.
Yeah.
But when he got there, that's where the gift was.
And to see the physical transformation of a person when they meet that pain that they've been, in this case, decades, about 3 decades of kind of holding it and numbing it through substances, all that kind of stuff, to get, to be there in that moment is one of the greatest, gifts, that you can get as a therapist. Yeah. And to have him smile, right, in this really warm, genuine way after just like kind of, crying for the first time in front of a male, for sure. And then just kind of in the TED Talk I talk about, he kind of giggled. He's like, wow, I see why people do this. And that was it was a radical shift in our work together. And that gave us the space and gave him the space to really start to explore some of these other areas. So earlier, when I talked about rigid and restrictive and reactive, like he was all 3 R's, kind of by default, that was like the automatic response to threat. But once he kind of got in touch with, his inner world and his heart, he was able to, create a pause and not, react that way and not be so rigid.
I want to ask you about how we can approach these conversations with those like this client, those who we have in our lives, right? Men that reflect this same behavior, right? These same layers that are built up in them. But first, I just would like a broader definition of each of the 3 R's and just some examples of how that turns up. So is there a particular order, or do we just pick one and run with it?
Pick one and run with it. Let's do that.
Rigid. What are some examples of rigid behavior?
So rigid behavior would be, so think of like extreme versions of self-reliance, right? Like I'm going to go on my own no matter what. And so if I'm injured, I'm going to power through it. I'm not going to stop to get help from a trainer, or I'm not going to go to my GP or whatever. Rigid autonomy, I guess, can fall into there too. This idea that I'm an island. I don't need anybody. I mean, that's, nonsense.
Right. Well, it just very much, that rugged individualism is something that has been ingrained in our culture for 100 years plus, more arguably, right? Yeah. That you should be able to make it on your own, to become a self-made man, which many self-made men will tell you it's very, very, very lonely and empty.
Yep. And I'm sorry, an infant wouldn't survive for more than a few hours alone. It's like we have never been alone. We have never been self-made throughout human history. Yeah. So that's what I mean about rigid. Like in approaching every situation with that one particular mode and not being able to be flexible. I guess if it's all right, I'll jump into restrictive because they relate.
Sure.
But I know a lot of your guests talk about it. This idea about emotional restriction is the one that like jumps out probably most easily. No doubt there are places where having some control over your emotions makes a lot of sense. And if you're in a high stress situation and people are really looking for somebody to be calm, that's okay. But if you take that rigid and that restrictive sense of emotion, I'm not going to show any emotion, and then you start to apply that to a romantic relationship, or as a parent to a child who just came home from school and was, got bullied on the playground, whatever, that's not going to work. So that rigidity and that restrictive idea of I'm never going to show somebody, the side of me, you're going to, like you would say, you're going to be lonely. That's not what engenders trust in relationships. And so that's that idea of restrictive, that we feel like there's, that we can't do these things.
Right.
I use this. Oh yeah, go for it.
Well, and from various experiences, right? Like they learned along the way that they can't be open. Right. And this isn't just men, this is anyone. Yeah. Like somewhere along the line, they were hurt or experienced an emotion, which then ingrained a belief in them that if I behave this way, I will feel that negative feeling again. So I can't show love. I can't bare my soul. I can't be gregarious, outgoing, extroverted, because ABC experience has continually told me that is not possible. Very common in Australia. We have, and this isn't just Australia, but we have this phrase. I don't know if you've heard of it, Ryan. Tall poppy syndrome.
I have. I've been there. Yep.
Yeah, been there. So tall poppy syndrome, basically, long stem flower, and if it grows higher than the others, you trim it and cut it back. And so if you feel like in your community, in your friend group, in your profession, that if you're starting to kick some goals and achieve some great things, and those around you are not for it, that they feel like they need to bring you back down to earth and put your feet on the ground. And then there may just be a case of tall poppy syndrome at play, where they're trying to bring you down to save themselves from feeling a certain way. So from my experience growing up in an all boys private school, talk about toxic behavior.
Sure.
Anytime I achieved something, it felt horrible, because the response and the reception I got was, "Oh, mate, you're showing us up, aren't you? Oh, look at you, Mr. Gold Medal. Oh, I bet you feel good now, don't you?" That every single week after going to compete on the weekends, that's exactly what I got, which made me think, well, achieving isn't making me feel full, whole, loved, appreciated. Then I'm just not going to try as hard.
It's such a good example too of this idea about emotional restriction. And so if somebody is told, keep it in, you're not allowed to show anything, not only are you maybe or you think you're protecting yourself against pain, future pain, you're also defending yourself against joy and all those positive emotions. And I know Brene Brown's been talking more about that in some of her work. So like, your mates at school are like, rather than recognize the joy it feels to be successful or something, and to be able to take joy in the joy of others, right? It's much easier to just, if I can't feel it and I can't appreciate myself, I'm not going to let you have it, right? So I'm going to cut the head off the poppy.
Absolutely. And like you said there, when we close the door to one thing, we're usually closing the door to multiple others.
Yep.
Right. And so by keeping that open look, in the restrictive part, I think it's important for people listening, especially the men out there, it's a habit. It's a really challenging thing to go from that operant conditioning of, look, I need to protect myself, because perhaps you come to this show to get a sense or a feeling of community, to feel like there are men out there that can connect to how you actually feel, but your home life, your work life, your social life may not support that. So Ryan and I can talk about these things like it's clear, it's easy, but it's not like that. Not a lot of people get access to professionals like Ryan to have those conversations, to break down those layers. So those listening out there, like, just know that this process, like, if we don't do anything about it, it's death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah.
But if we do something about it, sometimes it feels like 1,000 Band-Aids to get there.
Well, I want to say professionals like Ryan also struggle with this stuff. And so, like, earlier when you asked, like, how would I talk about this with students, or I'd say the same thing with my clients, I can't come at it like I got this all figured out, because people are good BS sniffers, right? And they'll say, I don't buy it. And so, like, the reactive R, I want to go back to something you just said. It feels almost reflexive. So I've been marinating in those same gender rules as a lot of other men. So I feel it too. Like my natural reaction sometimes under threat, I might default to like, I want to aggress. So I have to admit that there's that possibility. There's that part of me that feels that way. But then it makes me have to work harder to kind of slow down the reel and say, well, what is it that I'm really feeling? So this is the reactive piece. And I talk about in the TED Talk, this, it's not my idea, but this emotional funnel system that we come into the world with a full range of emotions, human emotions, and we're allowed to experience fear and shame and guilt and all these types of things. But through our kind of male socialization, as we go through school, particularly we're adolescents, young adults, all that falls out of this little funnel is anger and aggression. And so when I work around that, like, that's that reactive part of masculinity. Like, I'm going to react to this threat with anger, defensive anger, righteous anger, rather than what was it like milliseconds before anger came up. Anger is there to serve a function. It's to help me feel protected, help defend me, but defend me against what? Shame. Maybe I'm not proud of what I just did, or humiliation, or regret, right? All these kind of like softer negative emotions. And so that's really what I think, like, the important work that we have to do as individuals, but also through therapy or other ways, is to slow down that reactive process and say, what was the micro emotion right before I felt this reaction? There's where we see change. I think that's where we change toxic behaviors.
And of course, what I'm about to say applies to all three, but definitely in the reactive department. Easier said than done.
Absolutely.
to catch either before it happens. See, the work for me, I find in not all cases, but most cases, is before I want to say that thing, before I want to behave in that way or make that inappropriate joke, I kind of like catch it just before it comes out. But there's been times in my past where it has slipped out or it has openly come out. And when I get that kind of adverse reaction to it, I feel like I want to double down. And that's where the anger comes out. Oh, no, I didn't mean it that way. I meant it this way. Oh, you guys are just judging because of this. And then boom, anger starts turning up as that kind of natural defense mechanism, because socially, anger for men, totally fine.
Yeah.
It's like the lowest hanging fruit of emotions.
Yeah.
And have you experienced this? Because I couldn't have helped but notice in my time doing New Warrior trainings with the Mankind Project, sitting in men's circles, that more often than not, when we do like a process to help a man move through something, that anger is the first thing that turns up. But once we give that anger a voice, once we validate that anger and feel like it's been heard or it's been released, boom, sadness. Like tears, just tears and tears and tears. I'm curious of what you've experienced with helping men kind of remove some of those layers and move through anger, what you found beneath that.
Grief, deep, deep grief. And I think it's this realization, like all these missed moments in my life where I reacted in this way, where I pushed people away or pushed, that inside of me, down or away. I think men recognize that there's just a lot of grief that happens in that moment. Grief for the version of a boy that they weren't allowed to be, or the version of a man that they're not allowed to be, grief for hobbies or passions or interests that may have, society may have said that's not what boys do, whatever it might be. So I really think grief is a big part of that process. In being open to tolerating grief, because it's very easy though in a state of grief to wrap that thing back up and say, and get pissed at the grief, right? And then we're right back in that spot. So and I know the spaces that you help create, and in the Mankind Project in particular as well, in those retreats, they're holding space for grief. For people who haven't had a lot of opportunities to do that and have a safe place to express it.
Yeah, grief's definitely a tricky one, because not only does it come wrapped up in emotions that have been taboo for many men for a long time, but when that realization kicks in, it's very hard to run from it at that point, because previously it was a shadow, right? We knew it was there, but we didn't really want to acknowledge it, and it just followed us everywhere. But once it's out in the open and it's been called out, yeah, I've witnessed moments of true humility when I've seen men from the ages of 18 to 80 finally face that grief. But gosh, the other side of that grief, man, if we're talking like Joseph Campbell, like hero's journey, like that's the death. And then the rebirth comes right after. And that's where the gifts, like that's when life truly gets abundant. And when we get an opportunity, I think all men like to see themselves as people that don't blame and want to take ownership for, and do the things they need to do to fix the things they feel like they need to fix. Well, if that's the way you like to do things, man, get to the grief, get there quick. But also once you get there, what I've learned is to not leave too quick, to actually sit there and get to know it. Don't get stuck there, but really understand the depths of how that grief has impacted life until now.
But you've just identified the problem or the myth of autonomy and independence, because that grief has to be experienced in the presence of others. Right. Otherwise, you're screaming alone in a room, which actually I think, I've heard a lot of guys talk about, they'll have these private spaces where they're, banging their fist on the ground. But grief, to really move through it in a healthy way, it requires connection to others. And you describe spaces and places where men can feel that, right? And either see it modeled in a healthy way, or at least just be witnessed in a way that they're not shamed. And so I really feel strongly about this grief work needs to be in connection. It's really hard to do that stuff isolated or alone.
Listeners of the Mankind podcast, it is with great excitement and joy that I get to share the news with you that we finally, since the beginning of this pandemic, we finally have in-person trainings on the calendars worldwide. We're talking those new warrior trainings that you've heard so many times throughout the show, wondering what are these experiences? We've got high-level trainings for those that have already become involved in the Mankind Project, as well as for those of you that don't know yet, we have 19 online virtual trainings that cover a vast array of topics. We're talking race, gender, we're talking mission, we're talking accountability, we're talking leadership. There is so much abundance of resources involved in this organization that we want you to be aware of. So head to mkpusa.org if you're in the United States. That's mkpusa.org. And if you're worldwide, mankindproject.org to find a training near you. Mate, I'm curious that there seems to be kind of two paths going right now with men's work that we're finding. We have the more sensitive approach, right? I'd say the Mankind Project, although in the beginning was very warrior energy, now we're tapping more into kind of a lover approach, more lover energy of just, really giving men that space to kind of connect and touch with what's going on. But then we have, that warrior side, which is all about kind of reclaiming my power as a man and, necessary for sure. What have you witnessed as far as men that you've helped through these, like through your work, their reactions after, right? Let's just say they've touched that grief. They've been able to identify how that grief is impacting their behaviors, impacted their life up into this point. What does life look like for men then going forward? Do they naturally feel like a rubber band, like they have to just snap back and launch into, right, fixing everything, or is it action? I mean, I'm curious what you've witnessed.
Great disruption. But I think this goes for any significant change we make. So actually here's also where I want to plug for systems theory, right? This idea that when you make a change in one area of the system will often kind of push back and resist that change. So to your example, like if a male client makes this kind of radical realization that says, I'm going to be more open to the way I express, right, to people in my life. Now they go back into their life and they start doing it with friends or a romantic partner or family, with coworkers, whatever. They will sometimes learn that here are people who can tolerate it and accept it, maybe even better than tolerate. Here are people who can accept it, and here are people who can't. Yeah. They're in their own space. And so that disruptive piece is sometimes men figure out that my true friends, like these are the ones who I want to move forward with in this way. And these are some people who can't handle me in this way. And we're going to maybe have to agree that this isn't going to move any further. All right. This relationship isn't going to develop anymore. So it's not that, and I want to be clear too. I never ask a male to like throw out parts of self entirely. I don't think that's helpful. I think that's the fear that a lot of men have in this work. But to learn additional parts of self so they can have choice, so they can have agency. So in that moment, they can say, here's a moment that requires a compassionate response, but be able to choose to provide that. And maybe, you know what, this is not a moment. I need to go back and just, shut it down. So I think people start to learn about their social networks and what can tolerate some change and what can't, and then have to make hard choices.
Yeah, talk about those systems. I've seen the wife or the girlfriend drop off a man at a new warrior training weekend, and they didn't even stop the car. They're just like, get out. Yeah. And we hear this like booming kind of voice saying, fix him or he's not coming home. or that's unsaid, but that is the feeling of like, gosh, I'm at my wit's end of putting up with this guy. I'm really hoping that this time will change. And I've seen those same men go through some of the most powerful, moving, unpacking processes to really get to that grief, to get to that thing that their little boy didn't get. Right. Mm-hmm. Or just that love that they never received from their parent or whoever their role model was, and then return back to life. And all of a sudden they're like, I thought this was going to fix my marriage. It's just thrown a spanner in the works. Like everything is, like we're fighting more than ever. And I've heard this explained many times by leaders in the organization, especially at the end of a training. They say, you've just touched a piece of your shadow, right? This grief, this pain that you might be that you've been carrying your whole life. don't make any big life decisions in the next 6 months. And understand that we've given you some tools here. You've given your clients tools, Ryan. But the first time I swung a hammer when I was a little kid, my aim was off, right? It took practice to learn how to swing a hammer. It took practice to learn how to use a chisel. The same thing with these tools is that for the woman or man that dropped their partner off at a training like this, understand that life is going to feel very different for them after the experience. To have some patience and grace for what they're going through in trying to learn these new tools. And for the man that does the training or goes through the therapy or the process, yeah, just understand this is going to be fighting against, like in your client's example, 30 years of practice of one way of being. So this isn't an overnight fix kind of thing. This is a journey that will take you till your final breath.
Yeah. I'm so glad you gave an example of somebody being, thrown out of the car, because another reaction is that pendulum thing. So go back to R for rigid, right? So if I've been, rigid's like that, the pendulum swinging on one side, like all the way.
Yeah.
Sometimes those same individuals go through those experiences and they swing all the way to the other, right? So I'm going to go and tell everybody everything I'm thinking and feeling. And so the goal, I always remind people, is like, it might happen, but let's figure out what center feels like. And so again, so you feel like you have choice. Because if your reaction is to just let it all out at all times, that feels out of control too, and not in a healthy way. And so, yeah, that's in that sense, it's disruptive, and they have to kind of figure out who can tolerate what and what can I tolerate. I do want to just say one more thing about, because I see this in my masculinity class, particularly with female students. Sometimes they'll say, I want my partner, father, brother, whomever, roommate, to be more expressive. And then we start to dig in a little deeper and say, I'll ask the question, how did you respond the last time a male in your life expressed like genuine sadness, maybe even cried in front of you? And sometimes they'll catch themselves like, oh my gosh, like I went silent, or I made a joke or something. So sometimes people say, I want this, but they don't always realize that they're sometimes part of that social structure that reinforces some of that, and that can be disoriented for them. So this is where I say, like, we're all in it together. We can't say men need to change for the better without acknowledging that for that to occur, we have to create and change the environment under which these men live and operate. And we all have a role, independent of your gender identity.
Thank you for saying that. And thank you for speaking to that, you've just really done a great job of painting the picture of the macro, right? Of like the responsibility of us as human beings in helping be a part of the journey that we're on, whether it's about unpacking privilege, difference, unpacking power, whether it's gender, right? I'm just trying to understand how can we make the world a better place for women? How can we make the world a better place for men? Non-binary people, right? It isn't just, oh, well, African Americans are being impacted by racial challenges. Well, that's their problem. They need to figure that out. No, that doesn't work that way. It's not going to happen that way. We won't be able to achieve it. But understanding that for that woman or man that pushed their partner out of the rolling car and says, go fix yourself, to know that, if you truly do love your partner, and there is some fertile soil left for your relationship, that you got to hang in there with them and become an ally to that process, because it's challenging. And, I've been doing some interviews recently that haven't posted yet on the podcast, but, I had one guest, Warren Farrell, he wrote a book that is essentially called The Red Pill for the Men's Movement, right? And a lot of feminists can't stand the guy. Like to them, he's the enemy, right? And then I just spoke with another guest who is, she hosts, Megan Chance. She hosts a show called the Faith and Feminism podcast, which is, what a cool intersection. We had a great time together.
I bet.
And I spoke to her about how we can move forward. I spoke to Warren about how we can move forward. And they said the exact same thing. We have to do it together. this us versus them approach, which you would assume a feminist would take, you would assume that someone in the men's movement would take. Really, the larger amount of us don't subscribe to that us versus them mentality. But that is the narrative, though. That is the greater narrative that's happening in media. It happens in some conversations we have at a coffee shop with people. Is this whole thing, well, they're the villain, we're the good guys, they're the problem, we have to overcome this by beating them. No.
And how convenient, right, as a response, because it doesn't require me to change. It doesn't require me to do anything differently, right? And so, I have two responses to that. Even the challenge between those two camps. One is like, my own, people ask me like what my definition of masculinity is. And I always say, like, you can express whatever version of gender you want, as long as it satisfies two criteria. It doesn't harm self and it doesn't harm others. So I think that gives us a lot of leeway to then start to, define these things for ourselves. But the second one is, I don't know, maybe half the world is, male identified. Okay. That's billions and billions of people here. We also have to have some humility, and there have to be multiple ways to reach men. So, and if I say my way is the only way, so if my, focusing on the love or the warrior, whatever it might be, if I say you have to do it this way or you're doing it wrong, I'm going to be missing a whole lot of men who are ready and willing to explore and make some change. So we do have to create space for meet men where they're at to support change. Again, meeting those criteria, as long as it doesn't harm them as individuals nor others in their lives. I think if we could get around that, there's enough perspectives to connect with enough men to make some real change. It sounds fanciful, but that's it keeps me going.
Good. Well, and I think it should, because therein lies the challenge. We as men traditionally love linear paths. There's got to be a 12-step plan to make this happen. But to understand that, to inherently speak to a male, what's considered a male issue, which isn't, we know that, but to reach the man who feels like they are a part of a male problem is going to require something that's traditionally feminine.
Yep.
Nurture, care, right? Fluidity, flexibility, to know that this process is messy. It's not A, B, C, D. No, it's A, and then we're going to go to get to B by rendezvousing through F and hanging out at J and going up to Z, and whatever that path looks like, to know that, right, it's an individual responsibility to be able to own what we can own, do the work that we need to do, find whatever level of consciousness that we need to find so that we can know our role in all of this. Because like you said, it's so easy to be like, well, they're the problem. And that totally just removes me from having anything to do with the solution.
Yeah. So I heard Malcolm Gladwell in an interview weeks ago. He was talking about racism in the United States. He said, if every individual got rid of, was no longer racist, he's like, you would still have racism in the United States because of the structures, right, that we have in place. I love that analogy to think about gender too. So even if all of us as individuals, say, masculinity is going to be different, unless we change the structure. So you talk about care and nurture. Well, what structures do we have in place that support boys developing those nurturing and caring skills? What do we have in the workplace to support new fathers? The time, paid time off. All right. So there's lots of examples in the criminal justice system. What do we have in place? Unless we're willing to all together kind of work on the structures, we're going to continue to perpetuate that stuff. And so it really does require everything, everybody.
Man.
No hard task.
Yeah, exactly. Now, we'll get to it we'll get to it Thursday.
Got it all figured out.
We'll get to it on Thursday. Yeah. Well, so mate, it seems like we've come full circle here. We wanted to start the conversation talking about, toxic masculinity. I think we did a pretty good job of first starting by saying, it's a phrase that's weaponized. And my understanding of it now is it's not a helpful phrase. It doesn't clearly define men. It doesn't clearly define behavior. So we instead need to change the conversation to speaking to that individual and the structures, right, that are at play here, knowing that one person's behaviors doesn't represent a whole, a whole group. for lack of a better word. So I want to ask you, man, imagine you're sitting in a room full of teenagers, right?
Sometimes I am.
Sometimes you are. All right, cool. Well, yeah, perhaps you can draw from experience here. So you're sitting in front of let's just say a whole theater of teenagers, boys and girls. What would you say to them about what life looks for them now and what it's going to look like for them when they leave high school, college? Kind of like, here's kind of the ground that you're going to be stepping into. Here's the conversations that you're going to be hearing around your place in all of it.
Oh, that feels as daunting as the changing the world. It's funny, like, this trite cliche, as it gets better, jumped in my head, but no, actually, I'm gonna give you a quote from an Aussie back in '92, Colin. He wrote a book about masculinity. Here's actually what I would share with them, and it's more about a wish or a hope for them. And I am going to read the quote just because sometimes I mess it up. But this would be a call to men, but then those in the world, when you leave high school, or as you're thinking about the journey, I want you to learn to be strong without hardness, soft without fear, powerful without oppression, gentle without shame, knowledgeable without arrogance, nurturing, led with humility, and themselves with joy. So what I love about it is it's that both and. It's saying be and embrace your full humanity. Find ways to do that and connect with people who celebrate that and support it, because those are the people who you want to have in your life.
Beautiful, Ryan. Beautiful, mate. The narrative for me was be a successful man, and I would have much preferred to have heard that on my graduation day. So, mate, beautiful words. And who was that? What was his name?
Colling. His last name was Colling, Colling. I'm blanking on the name of his book. I should have looked it up.
Okay.
But it was an early '90s book on masculinity.
Sure.
But he's an Aussie. Check it out.
Awesome. We'll make sure to throw that into the show notes once we do some research. Mate, how can we find out more about your work? And find out more about you?
Oh, well, I mean, part of me wants to devote, like, anybody who wants to know about this work is, go through all this Mankind Project content. If you've missed episodes, go back and listen to them. I'm updating my website now, drmckelley.com. But there's a lot of other good resources out there. I will say you had a guest, Daniel Ellenberg, a while ago. He and four of us are kind of starting to some work called Strength with Heart. So check out strengthwithheart.com, trying to bring more programming into organizations to support organizational health for men. So otherwise, just, there's so much good stuff out there. And I'd say starting with Mankind Project, there's a lot there.
Beautiful, mate. Well, I appreciate the endorsement while we get to endorse you as well. And hey, Daniel, I know you're listening, mate. Thank you. Thank you for this introduction to Ryan, mate. This isn't going to be the last time you're on here, I'm sure, because, mate, there's a million things I want to talk to you about in the future. So let's just say seed planted, and until next time.
Can't wait. Appreciate it, Brandon.
Beautiful.
Thanks so much.
Awesome. And for all of you that have been joining us live here on the Mankind Project Facebook page, thank you for your comments. Thank you for your check-ins. Thank you for checking in with us as well. We've got a couple thousand of you that have joined us today, and lots of attention, lots of comments there. So some agree, some don't agree, and it's all welcome. Understand, it's all welcome, because you're contributing to the conversation so long. How'd you say it, Ryan? As you're not hurting yourself or others.
Got it. Nailed it.
Yeah, bingo. All right, guys, we'll see you very soon. Ryan, hang around for a hot second, and lots of love.
Thanks. Take care.
This has been the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. I have been your host, Brandon Clift, and I personally want to thank our guest for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. And of course, I want to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you make it a heck of a lot easier for us to let men out there in the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. Special thanks, of course, goes to my incredible team, Marketing and Communications Director Boyson Hodson. Producer and editor of this episode, Michael Russo, who makes me sound so much more intelligent than I actually am, so of course, special kudos goes there. And if you've been enjoying the music throughout this episode and all of our episodes, check out Jim, Donovan, and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. Now, the fee for this episode is simple. If you found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, remember that life doesn't happen to us, it happens for us, so long as we rip the pen out of fate's hand and become the author of our own story. So my friend, pick up the pen and we'll see you next week. Lots of love.